Okay, let's unpack 1904. This here, it feels less like just a date on a calendar and more like a pivotal, almost chaotic intersection.
It really
We
does.
have this monumental American ambition, incredible technological showmanship, decisive politics, and then just catastrophic environmental failures all happening at once.
It's Year of Reckoning. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going into the sources that capture this moment. We're covering three massive simultaneous events:
Right.
a huge presidential election, the world's largest fair celebrating progress, and at the same time, this string of infrastructure failures across the country, which, were meticulously documented by the U.S. Geological Survey.
And the opening anecdote in the sources is just pure spectacle.
Yeah.
We have to start with the election night marvel, November 7, 1904. The New York Times puts this massive searchlight on top of their brand new headquarters.
24 stories high, right at 42nd and Broadway, the spot that would literally become Times Square because of this building. And think about the symbolism. This giant beam of light, you could see it for miles. It was basically the original real-time election results ticker.
I love that.
The signal was simple. If the beam pointed east, the Democrat, Alton B. Parker, had won.
And if it pointed west,
Theodore Roosevelt stays in office.
you just imagine that.
Yeah.
Whole city looking up, waiting to see which way this giant finger of light is going to point.
And when it pointed west for Roosevelt, that single act, that civic showmanship, it helped cement Times Square's entire identity with bright carnival-style lights.
Amazing.
It really was. So that brings us to our core question. How did this year of massive ambition, of spectacle, and this deep upheaval, how did it fundamentally shape the policies and, the psychology of the 20th century?
Let's start with that certainty the light pointed to. Roosevelt won, and he won easily. But the contest between him and Alton B. Parker is fascinating because it wasn't really about policy.
Not at all. If you actually look at their stances, they were remarkably similar.
So what was the campaign about?
Personality, purely personality. The Democrats, they tried to frame Roosevelt's presidency as arbitrary and erratic, that he was this dangerous showman.
And the Republicans just leaned right into that. They played up his energy, his foreign policy successes, his whole reputation for being tough on monopolies.
They basically positioned him as this unstoppable force of the modern age, and the country bought it overwhelmingly.
We're talking about the largest popular vote margin of any candidate in the entire century between 1820 and 1920.
Yeah, an 18.8% margin. He was also the first presidential candidate ever to get over 300 electoral votes.
And that result showed a real shift. Roosevelt swept every region except the South. Missouri even voted Republican for the first time since 1868. The map was changing.
And the lead up to that nomination, especially on the Democratic side, was just full of drama.
Well, Roosevelt's path was pretty smooth, right? His main conservative opponent, Senator Mark Hanna, had died in February.
Right. But to appease the party's conservative old guard, they let them choose the vice presidential candidate. So they got Senator Charles W. Fairbanks.
Okay, so the Republican side is settled, but the Democrats?
The Democrats were pure conflict. The former nominee, William Jennings Bryan, he actively hated their choice, Judge Parker.
Hated him.
Publicly denounced him, called him a tool of Wall Street.
Wow.
And this division, it sets the stage for one of the most daring moves in political history. The party platform, you see, was silent on the biggest issue of the day, the gold standard.
Okay.
So Parker, right after he's nominated, sends a letter to the convention. He says he supports the gold standard, and if they don't agree, they should decline his nomination right now.
Wait, that sounds like political suicide. Why would he take that gamble to challenge his own party's convention?
Because for him and for his backers, it was a core principle, and it was probably also about attracting the kind of corporate money that would otherwise go to Roosevelt. He forced their hand.
Did it work?
They ratified his stance, but it just fractured the party even more.
And speaking of financing, their choice for vice president was something else. Henry G. Davis. He was 80 years old.
80! The oldest major party candidate ever nominated. He was a millionaire mine owner and a banker.
Let me guess. They hoped he'd pay for the campaign himself.
That was the desperate hope. A hope that was completely unrealized.
It seems like the big takeaway here is that corporate money was just fundamental in 1904. Roosevelt, for all his anti-monopoly talk, was no exception.
Not at all. His campaign manager was George B. Cortelyou, the former Secretary of Commerce and Labor.
So he knew where all the bodies were buried.
Exactly. The sources say he explicitly used his inside knowledge of corporate secrets to, quote, extract large contributions from corporations. He targeted insurance companies, railroad kings like E.H. Harriman, all to make sure Roosevelt carried New York.
And Parker wasn't clean either. He had support from Morgan banking interests, and there was this charge that one of his big backers was on the payroll of Standard Oil.
A charge that was never disproven, despite a massive challenge. The flow of insider money was completely bipartisan.
Which is a perfect segue from those smoke-filled rooms to the bright, shining spectacle of American capitalism on display in St. Louis.
Yes, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, the World's Fair. It was truly 1904's greatest piece of showmanship.
It was just monumental. It ran from April all the way to December. We're talking 1,200 acres, over 1,500
The
buildings.
scale is staggering. The Palace of Agriculture alone was 20 acres. And while, historians today tend to focus on the themes of race and imperialism,
Right.
the average person there remembered something totally different. A dazzling preview of the future mixed with pure entertainment.
The technology exhibits were the headliners, right? The palaces of electricity and transportation.
Absolutely. You could see things that really foreshadowed modern life, like the telautograph. It was this machine that could transmit your handwriting instantly.
So like a precursor to the fax machine.
Basically, yeah. And on the medical front, there was the Finsen light. It treated a form of tuberculosis and pioneered phototherapy. The inventor had just won the Nobel Prize for it.
But the exhibit that really stands out has to be the infant incubators. This was, well, it was on the Pike, the entertainment area.
Which is just wild to think about. This wasn't a sterile hospital wing. It was part of the spectacle.
They had actual human lives on display.
24 preterm babies. Their parents had entrusted them to this exhibit. They were cared for by nurses inside these airtight glass boxes. The concept, using controlled heat and oxygen to sustain life, was revolutionary.
And what's so striking is how it was funded, not by a grant, but by curiosity.
You paid 25 cents to go in and see the babies. And that money, over $181,000, funded the whole project. It led directly to the modern medical isolates we use today.
It's such a strange mix of necessity and, well, gawking.
It speaks volumes about the era. And speaking of spectacle, they also had the first airship contest.
Did anyone win the big prize?
The $100,000 prize went unclaimed, but it did feature the first public dirigible flight in America, showing off the promise of aviation.
And of course, the food. The fair introduced so many things we still have today.
Dr. Pepper and puffed wheat cereal made their national debut. It popularized the waffle-style ice cream cone and iced tea.
And my favorite detail from the sources,
Let me guess. Jack Daniel.
Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey won the gold medal for the finest whiskey in the world.
But we can't look at this celebration of progress without also talking about the really uncomfortable imperial context. The fair was deliberately used to promote America's new role as an overseas power.
And that reality is just unavoidable when you see who else was on display.
Right. Geronimo, the former Apache war chief, was literally exhibited in a teepee for people to come and look at.
And there was a whole Philippine exposition section, an Igorot village.
Yes, and it's noted that T.S. Eliot, who was from St. Louis, visited and was inspired to write a story based on what he saw. This mix of high-tech marvels and the objectification of conquered people, it really shows the deep contradictions of 1904.
That ambition, that belief in total control over nature and progress, it brings us to the brutal flip side of the coin.
The reality.
The reality that while the culture was dazzling, the country's physical infrastructure was failing dramatically. The USGS reports on destructive floods in 1904 are just devastating.
If the fair was America looking forward, the infrastructure failures were America realizing its fundamental systems were unsound. Let's start with the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania that March.
The damage was huge, right? Something like $7.9 million.
A massive number for the time, but the cause wasn't what you'd think. It wasn't just heavy rain or snowmelt.
So what was it?
Ice. Massive, thick ice gorges that formed in narrow river bends and against islands. They created these huge, unstable natural dams.
And when those broke?
When they broke, like the one near Boyd's and Rupert on March 10th, it was terrifying. The river at one point dropped 14 feet almost instantly. A wave of ice and water just swept away everything.
And what's so interesting is that the damage was often made worse by our own engineering.
Yes, this is the key point. Railroad embankments, low highway grades, things built for progress.
How did they make it worse?
They acted like dams themselves. In Shoals, Indiana, a railroad embankment basically trapped the floodwaters, causing the river to rise several feet higher than it would have naturally. It flooded property that should have been safe.
So the very infrastructure built to modernize the country was actively making natural disasters more intense.
It was a self-inflicted wound, exactly. And you see it again on the Wabash River. The worst flood there since 1885. A 300-foot break in a levee near Vincennes flooded 15,000 acres of land.
I remember that detail from the report. They said the levee breaks were potentially caused by, what was it, groundhogs or human beings?
That phrase just perfectly captures the era's lack of planning, doesn't it? Was it a burrowing animal or was it sabotage? The end result was the same: ruin. The Kansas River flood dumped 2 to 6 feet of sand on 10,000 acres of prime farmland.
And it wasn't just rivers in the Midwest. Out in New Mexico, an irrigation dam on the Pecos River just failed.
The Lake Avalon Dam. A 450-foot section of it just washed away. And again, the listed causes were either burrowing animals, a constant problem, or just faulty construction at the base.
But the lesson was immediate.
It was crystal clear. They needed better engineering, and more importantly, they needed to store that floodwater for irrigation, turn the catastrophe into a resource.
And as a final, brutal counterpoint, while half the country was drowning, the eastern U.S. was in a severe drought.
Especially in the upper Ohio drainage basin. And this wasn't just a weather event, it was a full-blown economic catastrophe.
For 7 months, navigation was basically shut down between Wheeling and Pittsburgh.
13 million bushels of coal were just stuck.
Yeah.
Miners were put on halftime because there was no way to ship the coal.
And what about industry?
Steel and iron companies, like the Edgar Thomson Company, had to shut down or scale back. They didn't have enough water for their boilers. And the water they did have was so low and full of sulfur it was corroding their equipment.
So even the railroads were in trouble.
They were hauling water over long distances just to keep their engines running. Socially, it was a disaster. Wells dried up. Farmers were ruined, and towns had no water for fire protection. The only solution, again, was better storage, better planning.
This national realization that all this unchecked power, whether from nature or from corporations building shoddy infrastructure, was leading to disaster. That brings us to the muckrakers.
Theodore Roosevelt's term for them. The journalists who focused on the dirtiest corners of society. They became this indispensable force driving progressive era reforms.
And the ultimate example has to be Ida Tarbell. Her work culminated in 1904 with the publication of The History of Standard Oil Company.
Her book was just meticulous. It exposed the predatory practices, the sheer ruthlessness of John D. Rockefeller's trust. It detailed exactly how they destroyed competition.
And it led to direct action.
Absolutely. Her work was a direct contributor to the Sherman Antitrust Act getting its teeth, and eventually the 1911 Supreme Court decision that dissolved Standard Oil. When you think about the corporate money in the 1904 election, you see how vital her work was.
Then you have Upton Sinclair. His writing during this time led to one of the greatest cases of, well, unintended consequences in journalism.
His goal was explicitly socialist. He wanted to expose the horrific poverty and exploitation of workers in the Chicago meatpacking plants.
But that's not what the public focused on.
Not at all. The public reaction was singular: outrage over the quality of the meat, the stories of tubercular beef, the filth. Sinclair famously said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach."
So his work leads to legislative action, but on a totally different agenda.
Exactly. Consumer protection. His findings, championed by TR, led directly to the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act.
So it all connects. The corporate influence in the election, the infrastructure failures from haphazard construction, it all underscored the absolute need for the reforms the muckrakers were demanding. The failures of 1904 forced the nation to accept federal oversight.
1904 was a year of just stark, painful contrast. You have the political certainty and the technological grandeur of the World's Fair right up against the terrible human cost of industrial greed and environmental failure. We didn't even mention the worst maritime disaster in New York City's history happened that June, the General Slocum, killing over 1,000 people.
The need for good engineering, for transparent politics, for journalistic accountability, it all came to a painful head. The sources really show that 1904 was the year the country, while celebrating its future in St. Louis, was forced to reckon with the immense power of nature and the equally immense, often corrupt, power of its own institutions.
And that raises a really important question for you, the listener, to think about. We saw that infrastructure failures back in 1904 were sometimes caused by simple physical things, like a railroad embankment blocking water or a burrowing animal weakening a dam. So, as we rely more and more on incredibly complex digital and physical systems today, from AI governed logistics to our fragile electrical grid, what are the modern, seemingly innocuous obstructions